Moral disengagement is interesting for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that it's widely neglected among researchers in moral philosophy, and its existence appears to be incompatible with all of the major theories about humans' moral abilities. Theories that appeal to emotion, theories that appeal to some kind of modular process or linguistic analogy, and also the leading dual process theory, I think will all struggle with moral disengagement. I'm not sure how the causation goes here, whether the neglect is the cause of the incompatibility or conversely, but it's interesting. But wait a minute, let me step back. What is moral disengagement? What is moral disengagement? Let's start there. So the research on this all comes from Bandura and his colleagues, and I'm using a lot this 2002 theory paper, which provides a nice link to some of the experimental research that we'll get onto later. So let's start with the theory and come to the evidence later. So I'm just going to give you the theory purely as an idea, a hypothesis. So Bandura's key idea is about self-regulation. So he thinks that ethical reasoning is typically done in the course of a process of self-regulation. And here's how it works. He thinks that humans over the course of development adopt standards of right and wrong, that they judge their own actions in the light of those standards, and that they apply sanctions to themselves when their actions fail to live up to those standards, and perhaps reward themselves when they do. So this is Bandura's key idea. He thinks that ethical reasoning and action is bound up in a process of self-regulation. Moral conduct, according to him, is motivated and regulated through the ongoing exercise of evaluative self-influence. So if we were to put this very crudely, we might say something like this. Typically, if you do something which is by your own lights wrong, you're likely to feel bad. The more wrong you think the action is, the worse you're likely to feel. Doesn't always work that way, but quite often. And if you've ever done anything pretty terrible, right, I know I have, you'll know that you can, as a consequence of that, spend quite a long time punishing yourself afterwards, and quite harshly. So when we talk about bad feelings, that appears to be playing it down. But those of us who have done terrible things in the past will know that that bad feeling, right, can actually be pretty severe. It can be pretty crippling. The sanctions are actually more serious than that suggests. But here's the thing. The fact that we apply these self-sanctions, that we influence our own behaviour, can sometimes prevent us from getting things that we want. And of course, in a way, that's the whole point, isn't it? You know, there are things that you want, but getting those things would involve inflicting harm on other people. And the process of self-regulation ensures that there is at least a kind of balance between you getting what you want and you harming other people, right? So it seems like a reasonable mechanism. So the theory, anyway, this is the theory. So then there's a question, right? What happens in this situation? There's something that you want and you do decide to get it, and then you apply self-regulation. You can kind of anticipate that something bad's going to happen to you. So here's what I want to do. I want to do an imaginative exercise, right? A thought experiment, not in the philosophical sense, but in the really practical sense. So I want you to imagine that you're tempted to do something that is by your own standards wrong. And in particular, I want you to think about this scenario. You've been diagnosed with the COVID. You're certain that you've got it. You've got no reason to doubt that. But you've decided that instead of self-isolating, as you're required to do, what you're going to do is to get on a train or get in a car and go and travel somewhere and do some stuff, right? So you're tempted to do something that by your own standards is wrong. I'm assuming that's wrong by your own standards because it's likely to harm other people. It's obvious, or it should be obvious, that doing this will put others' lives at risk. And I take it most people's moral standards will exclude that, right? That's something that should be avoided. You naturally are going to anticipate feeling bad. There are going to be self-inflicted sanctions if you surrender to the temptation. So I think you know that, and I want you to imagine how those sanctions will be imposed. And I want you to imagine that you haven't yet done this thing, but you've decided that you will give in to the temptation and that you will do it. right? But you won't necessarily do it today. So you might imagine that you're going to do it tomorrow. And perhaps you haven't exactly decided, it's just that you know yourself well enough to know that this will happen, or perhaps you have decided. So imagine, if you would, that you're in this situation. Imagine that you're in this situation, and now I want you to think, ideally with your lecture buddy, what kind of things might you tell yourself in this situation? What kind of things might you say to yourself, knowing that tomorrow you are going to go and give in to temptation and do something which, by your own lights, is actually wrong, but you're going to do it anyway? What are you going to tell yourself in the next 12 or 24 hours before that actually occurs? With your lecture buddy, 90 seconds, go. Okay, so I'm going to confess to you some of the things that I'm likely to tell myself in this situation. So everyone else is doing it would be a very common thing. Johnson himself isn't sticking to the rule, so why should I? I think this is a mad piece of reasoning, but we've seen actually a lot of that. We've seen a lot of that reasoning going on around us anyway. And I must admit that I'm often tempted by that when I'm in the process of doing something wrong, that kind of reasoning, even though when I'm not in the process of doing something wrong and observing other people, I can see it for what it is. The rules are stupid. It's only a mild illness for most people. It's only a mild illness for most people. So focus on the consequences. It's something like the flu. We shouldn't be in lockdown anyway. All of this is exaggerated, right? The cost to the economy is not worth the number of human lives saved. Or I'm unlikely to infect anybody. I'm unlikely to infect anybody. My actions aren't actually going to be harmful. Now, the reason I've asked you to do this, quite personal exercise and quite revealing, is that these are all examples of moral disengagement in action. These are all examples of moral disengagement in action. So while I think it's important that we have good evidence for Bandura's theory of moral disengagement, that we show that that theory is well supported by evidence and can be challenged, it's useful, I think, also to reflect that the theory kind of resonates with everyday experiences. The theory, you can kind of see that something like this is likely to be going on, right? It doesn't seem like a particularly bold or mad conjecture. Not to say it's right, it might well be wrong, but you kind of get an intuitive sense of what's going on with moral disengagement. So any of these pieces of reasoning would count as examples of moral disengagement. And if we were doing a study, one thing that we might do here is we might try to take people of different political persuasions. So those members of the Conservative Party, for example, who have notoriously disregarded the scientific advice and tried to minimise that and spread ignorance about COVID, probably you would see high levels of moral disengagement amongst those people, because for the most part, they don't see themselves as any less morally upstanding than you or I, right? Despite the things that they're obviously doing there. So moral disengagement is a mechanism for balancing out getting what you want and applying the self-sanctions. What we're trying to do here is, in effect, to minimise or even evade, if we can, the self-imposed sanctions, the bad feelings, through the process of moral disengagement. So here's Bandura's model. Bandura distinguishes 8 processes of moral disengagement which have different effects on the process which would otherwise lead to self-sanctions. So, for example, moral justification or euphemistic labelling can prevent you from identifying the conduct as reprehensible by your own standards in the first place, and so cut off that process of self-sanction. You can also minimise or misconstrue the consequences, right? It's a mild illness for most people, right? Focus on that, and you don't see the detrimental effects so clearly, and so the self-sanctions are minimised for you, and so on. So here's Bandora's sort of theoretical model. Very nice. Now I think, look, this is really a captivating idea, but for our purposes, it's important. I think it's important partly just because Bandora's put a finger on something which has explanatory importance. We'll see more about that later. But there's a special reason why it's coming at this point in the course on moral psychology, and that's because there's a very central role for reason in moral disengagement. Now there's two ways to see this, or two things to see rather. One is that many of these processes, like moral justification, misconstruing the consequences, attribution of blame, displacement of responsibility, those are all processes which are nearly always bound to involve significant levels of reasoning. So that's the first point. The second point is that this reasoning is done in anticipation of feeling bad, in anticipation of the process of self-sanctioning. So this is reasoning which occurs prior to some moral intuitions and actions, and influences those moral intuitions and actions. What you're essentially trying to do in moral disengagement is to shift your moral intuitions about a particular act or sequence of acts that you are performing in order to avoid feeling bad, in order to avoid the self-sanction that follows from that because of your own standards. So there's an important role for reasoning in moral intuition and moral action if moral disengagement is indeed a widespread and genuine phenomenon, if there really is such a thing as Bandora suggests. So why is that role of reason significant? Well, here's one thought. This is really a minor idea actually, but it's quite tempting to think that where your moral intuitions are driven by feelings, they're unreliable, and when they're driven by reasoning, they're reliable. Right? Now, it's not actually proponents of the view that moral intuitions are driven by feelings don't generally accept this, but it is quite tempting to accept that, and you can see that philosophers who are proponents of reason-based views of moral intuition often think that the feelings are unreliable. But actually what we can see here is that it's quite wrong to think that the role of reason goes with the moral intuition being reliable. All of the cases of moral disengagement that you're going to see, which I think is the best case for actually demonstrating that reason is involved in moral intuition, are cases where the reasoning itself is quite abysmal. The reasoning itself is quite abysmal, so the intuitions that flow from it are not in any sense thereby justified. Reasoning seems to make your moral intuitions worse, not better. On the whole, at least in the case of moral disengagement. Maybe that's too pessimistic, maybe there are good cases as well. Now here's a more significant point. If we reflect on the role of reason in moral disengagement, we can see that moral intuitions are not entirely consequences of feelings. Some moral intuitions are going to be, at least in part, consequences of reasoning from known principles. What I'll show you later is that this is a problem for practically any theory in moral psychology. A good theory that generates readily testable predictions and is widely accepted will have problems with this fact about moral disengagement. More on that later.